Today on Diabetes Connections Type 2, this endocrinologist tries to have every single one of his patients use a continuous glucose monitor. Dr. Thomas Grace is going to explain the specific benefits he thinks people who don't use insulin can get from a CGM and shares a few studies just released at a big diabetes conference, including new research around using GLP-1s, medications like Trulicity, Victoza, and Ozempic with a CGM. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Hello and welcome to Diabetes Connections Type 2. I am your host, Stacey Sims. Always so glad to have you here. One of the things I love doing is talking to these technology companies when they are just presenting the information they give at these big diabetes conferences. There's really just a handful all year long. The latest was the International Conference on Advanced Technologies and Treatments for Diabetes, also called the ATTD Conference. That took place in Europe. I did not go to that one, but I will be at what everybody calls ADA, the American Diabetes Scientific Sessions Conference. That happens in June. This year it's in Orlando. Lots of news will come from that, and I'll be bringing as much of it to you as I can. But when we say ATTD or ADA, that's what we're talking about. You know, we have defined a ton of terms so far. I always start the show off with one, and this is episode 27. So we've gone through quite a bit. So if you're new and you're hearing terms that you're not quite sure you understand, MARD, A1C, the very basics of using a CGM, please check out our previous episodes right at the beginning, the first couple of minutes, talking about and defining these terms, because I know when my son was diagnosed with type 1, I'm sure the doctor told us everything we needed to know, but I didn't remember any of it when I got home, and I really like having the basic explanations. So this week, we're going to talk about GMI or EA1C. These are two terms for what's basically the same thing. It's the estimated A1C that you get when you use a CGM. We defined A1C in the very first episode. So that test measures your blood sugar levels over the past 3 months. This test specifically gauges the amount of blood sugar, blood glucose, that's attached to the hemoglobin in your red blood cells. It's 3 months because that's the average lifespan of a red blood cell. But as CGM has become more common, there's something else you can use in concert with an A1C, not instead of it. What it's called on the device depends on the brand. Libre uses EA1C, estimated A1C. Dexcom uses GMI, glucose management indicator. I'm going to stick with GMI. I actually think it explains it better, and I'll tell you why. Because you're not using anything to do with how much sugar is attached to your red blood cells. So I don't want to even say A1C when I'm talking about this. The GMI just looks at whatever the CGM is telling it and uses those numbers to come up with an average. There have been a bunch of studies on this. I'm going to link this up in the show notes. And most of them find that you can get a really good estimate of where you are over 3 months by just looking at 10 to 14 days of CGM data. Also, GMI will show you more about what's happening in terms of hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, or really high blood sugar, hyperglycemia. A1C doesn't show that. So the GMI, for many people, can be a better indicator of your trends over time. This may change in the future, but right now, most endocrinologists will tell you that both together, the A1C and the GMI, are really what you want. It gives them a great picture. It gives you something that you don't have to wait 3 months for. And if you're not sure where to find it in your CGM data, every manufacturer, and there are 4 CGMs right now in the United States. I mentioned Libre and Dexcom. There is the Eversense and Medtronic. All 4 of them have a way in their apps to find this value. Much of this information came from Healthline, and I will link up that article and more about the estimated A1C or GMI over at diabetes-connections.com. My guest this week is somebody I first saw on a screen at ADA, that conference I was telling you about last June. I saw Dr. Thomas Grace speak about why he wants to put every patient he sees with type 2 on a CGM, whether they use insulin or not. And I thought, that's interesting. What are they actually getting out of using a CGM? What's the benefit to you as you listen? Dr. Thomas Grace is an endocrinologist at the Blanchard Valley Diabetes Center in Findlay, Ohio. He was diagnosed when he was 3 years old with type 1 diabetes, and now he also works at Dexcom. He was named Dexcom's head of clinical advocacy and outcomes just this past fall. So, full disclosure, we're talking about CGM use here, and I think most of what we talk about can apply to any type of CGM, but Dr. Grace does work for Dexcom. He talks about that, he discloses that, but it's important you know it up front. Our conversation is up next. US Med sets the bar high when it comes to diabetes care. US Med excels in customer satisfaction, ranking number 1 in Dexcom customer surveys. And online, they're number 1 in Google and Facebook customer ratings among large national diabetes DMEs. With over 1 million satisfied diabetes customers since 1996, they've perfected the art of delivering better service and better care. From insulin pumps to diabetes testing supplies and the latest CGMs like Freestyle Libre 2 and the Dexcom G6, they've got you covered. Plus, they accept Medicare nationwide and collaborate with over 800 private insurers. US Med, your trusted partner in diabetes care. Your health, satisfaction, and peace of mind are their priority. Visit usmed.com/Stacy. That's usmed.com/STACEY. Dr. Tom Grace, welcome to the show. I am really glad to talk to you. I'm excited to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Stacy, thanks for having me. I'm excited to delve into this new podcast. You got Diabetes Connections for people with type 2.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had this idea last summer, and I went to ADA to kind of feel it out and see what people, whether they would be responsive to it. And I went to a Dexcom presentation where you were featured. They played a video of you talking about the advantage of CGM for people with type 2. And in fact, you were pretty clear that you try to put everybody in your clinic with type 2 on a CGM, or you urge them to do so. Let's just start right there. Is that true? Tell me about the thinking there.
Yeah, that's 100% true. To kind of delve into this, we got to understand kind of where I came into diabetes and treating it as a clinician. So about 7-8 years ago, I started a clinic for people with diabetes. And that was right at the same time Dexcom G6 was coming out. And to be honest, I was kind of hesitant as a clinician to pick that up right away because CGM, for my own personal self, I was diagnosed at the age of 3 with type 1, was a cumbersome product that really didn't offer me a lot of benefits. And as I was starting this clinic, there was one of the field reps from Dexcom. She came in with a sample G6. And to be honest, I wasn't really polite to her. I said, "No, this isn't for me or my patients." And thankfully, she left it on my desk. And it was about a week later. I was looking on the internet and I'd seen some people saying very nice things about it. I put it on for myself. And that trajectory literally changed the rest of my life. I saw immediately the benefits for not only myself seeing my glucose readings continuously throughout the day, but I knew that my patients could also benefit from this. As a clinician, we spend a lot of time telling people what to do or what not to do. And I think that some of that falls by the wayside even before they get outside the office. And I knew that this was a tool that could help support my patients reinforcing behaviors. So for people with type 1, as you well know, this is really a safety device, right? A lot of alerts and alarms in here that can really warn us before hypoglycemic episodes, but also this is the brains behind automated insulin delivery. We live in a world now where anyone with type 1 should have access to a continuous glucose monitor, automated insulin delivery. On the other side of that coin, though, is all of those patients with type 2 diabetes, even the ones that aren't at risk for hypoglycemia. They also should have access to their glucose readings. I hear the stories day after day, patients coming back in telling me they were empowered by learning what certain foods did to their glucose or seeing the benefits of physical activity reinforcing, healthier behavior. Hey, Dr. Grace, you won't believe it, but I wasn't taking all my medications before. No, yes. When they can see what happens when they take their medications, they're much more apt to do that appropriately. So not long after Dexcom G6 came out, I saw the benefits in my patient population, the majority of those being type 2. And it set me on this quest to get better insurance coverage, not only locally where I live at, but for all people with type 2 living not only in the state of Ohio, but anywhere in the United States. And as you well know, I recently joined Dexcom as the head of advocacy and clinical outcomes. And that's part of that project is I know in my own local community, I could only serve 3,000 patients. On the grand scheme of things, there are still so many people that aren't privy to the information that a continuous glucose monitor can give them. to help really reinforce their lifestyle choices and to do better with type 2 diabetes. So it's been a blessing having put that on. I'm very thankful that I did that. And as I said before, it kind of set me down this path that I'm on now.
I want to talk a little bit later more about insurance and questions that patients can ask if they perhaps don't have a Dr. Tom Grace in their corner. But I want to start with those patients. How do you explain to them? Someone comes into your office, they have type 2, they're not using insulin. How do you bring it up? What kind of things do you talk to them about?
I'm very lucky to work for a hospital system that affords me the time to do a little bit of education. And so every single patient that comes through my clinic, whether they have type 1 or type 2, gets the same basic education talk. Basically, what is the history of diabetes, right? That we're really lucky to have diabetes now because it wasn't more than 40 years ago that basically the clinician would say to people with type 1 specifically, unfortunately, you're not going to live as long as you used to or that you should. So basically, enjoy your time now. Now we're living in a time where we know that if we can really take control of our glucose, that our end metabolic outcomes aren't detrimental like they should be if our glucose is wildly uncontrolled. And so I kind of pump them up in that sense. I go through what is a cell, what does sugar do in our cells, and then how do we get sugar into the body? So really focus on a treatment modality that focuses on food, physical activity, and then tertiary medications. And I explain to them all, this is where I come in, regardless of what you do with number one, food choices, number two, physical activity. I will balance your medications to get your blood sugars running well, but I can't do that with a single finger stick a day or 2 in a week or none in 3 months, which patients typically come into the office with. I need to have this data. And even more beneficial is it's for you to go home because you can continuously learn about diabetes and what foods affect your glucose in different ways. You'll be able to see the reward or the better glycemic control or the glucose lowering ability of going for a walk. And then we can work on medications together. I give them all their little bit different goals, right? Not every patient is the same. If you came into the clinic with an A1C of 13, we're trying to get you maybe below 10 in the first 6 weeks. Whereas, I get some patients that come in with an A1C of 8. We're shooting for the ADA target of 7. So it's really individualized to each patient, but really it's a kind of a way to educate and motivate at the same time. And if they don't already have access to a continuous glucose monitor, I'm trying to put one on them in the clinic so they can leave. By the time they leave, they're already getting their glucose data back to them.
I am obviously not a medical professional. I'm a podcaster, but I get a lot of texts and calls from my friends, older, and my parents' friends with type 2 who get a CGM at their doctor's office. And whether they've gotten the education or not, they may not remember. And then they call me or they ask their friends, is this number okay? I'm spiking to this. I'm checking it a million times a day. I know that you are doing even more education than most doctors are, but what are the basics that people should know? Because I try to tell people, look, you want to stay under 180 as much as you possibly can. If you spike up to 200, but then you come down, use it to learn about different foods. Maybe one is better than another for you. Are there just a couple of things that you try to get people to remember? Because it's overwhelming.
Yeah. So 2 basic ones. Ready? Keep it in the gray zone. Try and keep it in the gray zone as much as you can, between 70 and 180. That is right at their fingertips. And the other thing is look before you eat and look after you eat. And that continued behavior over a week, over a month, over a year really does lend insights to the patients on the different food choices that they can make. So that's where the stories come back into the clinic. I love those stories, even though I've heard the same ones repetitively thousands of times. For example, you won't believe what orange juice does to my glucose readings, right? I chuckle at it inside every time I hear it, but I know that they're looking before and after. And what happens there is, I think it's maybe even subconsciously, the next time they have orange juice, because they may have it again, they're just not going to drink as much, or they'll have the insight to maybe change something, or maybe not have orange juice. That's the next meal. And that's what's constantly happening day after day, meal after meal. By the time, they come back to the clinic, you can see significant improvements from their AGP reports from when they first placed CGM on.
Do you find that we're so new into this, especially with people with type 2? Do you find that people use it for a long period of time? Or do they kind of get, okay, I've seen my doctor, I'm under 7 now, so, maybe I won't use it as much, maybe I won't check it as much? Or are your patients really, really finding success long term?
Yeah, excellent question. And I was just asked this at ATD as well. Is this something that is a temporary therapeutic, or is this something that we need long term? And I can say with great confidence out of my personal experience that out of sight, out of mind. What happens is patients tend to not pay as close attention when they don't have the data being fed to them continuously. And sad but true story, I've had patients that have done so well using a continuous glucose monitor that they've gotten off of all therapies, all medications. And at that point, their insurance will no longer cover CGM. And what happens usually is that they end up back in the clinic with an elevated A1C again. I have to put them back on CGM and then have to put them back on other medications. And so I've spent a lot of time over the years trying to argue with the insurances not to pull this away, because this, again, keeps people on track. It reinforces. And I don't know what it is or what the magic sauce is that keeps people looking and interested. But you can imagine that if you slip up one day, you accidentally eat something that you knew you weren't supposed to, and you don't really feel bad, right? Then, hey, you might do it again. And this behavior perpetuates itself. Yeah. So again, in my opinion, this is something that not only people should, they really want to pay attention to it. The worst scenario is that you're going to take something away from someone who really does want to pay attention. And then, you're going to put them on a path where they're not going to succeed like they could have on continuous glucose monitoring.
Let's talk about Stelo. Just recently, the Dexcom CGM that is meant for people with type 2 who do not use insulin got FDA approval. We talked about it here on our podcast earlier this year, but I was surprised that it was approved as an over-the-counter.
Yeah, so the first glucose biosensor in the United States approved for over-the-counter indication, looking to help serve our patients with type 2 diabetes, not on insulin. There's at least 25 million of them out there that don't have easy access, or that their clinician hasn't prescribed them a CGM. And so this will give them access to the therapy that everyone, again, with diabetes deserves access to. So we're going to be able to serve millions of people that wouldn't otherwise have good access to this technology.
It's interesting coming from the world of type 1 like you do. And, like I'm a mom of a kid with type 1. So our perception of what we get out of a CGM is a little bit different. You already mentioned alerts and alarms and things that are not on Stelo. So I'm thinking, is there technology here where a person wearing Stelo can see their numbers and then also easily get it to their clinician? Even an over-the-counter version of this, they can either show it to a doctor or download in the office?
Yeah, so what we're talking about here is bridging a data gap that's there, right? Where a patient may want to take some data from their continuous glucose monitor back to their clinician. I'm excited for that to happen, because ultimately what's going to happen is the clinician is going to hopefully adjust some things to get the better health outcomes for that patient. If I can tie this back into that research that we had talked about that I just recently presented at ATTD, in my own local community, a lot of clinicians were sending patients to the local health department who are not using CGM at all. And subsequently, as patients kept coming back to their clinic using CGM, they all became interested in it and all started prescribing it and all have clarity in their clinic, and they're all interpreting the data now. I think that aspect of using a continuous glucose monitor for a patient whose clinician may or may not be using it to start off with, this could really get things moving for CGM.
Well, you mentioned clarity, and for people who are not aware, can you kind of explain what that is? I want to tell you about AG1, the daily foundational nutrition supplement that supports whole body health. It makes me feel like I'm doing something good for my body, right? I'm giving it the nutrition it craves. AG1 is a science-driven formulation of vitamins, probiotics, and whole food-sourced nutrients. It helps you build your health foundation first. I get the travel packs, so I don't have to miss a day, and it just tastes great. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/Stacy. That's drinkag1.com/STACEY. Check it out.
Yeah, so Clarity is web-based software for both the end user, people with diabetes that have a continuous glucose monitor, and for clinicians. And for people using the smartphone app on their phone, they can see their glucose readings, but they can also go back in and historically look at data. Dexcom G7 really pushed us forward with that. It's all at the patient's fingertips. So even if a clinician was not didn't have Clarity in their office, then they could walk in and at their fingertips have all of their historic glucose data there. Now, what we find is most clinicians are interested in that, and they're using that in the office to look at historical data and kind of compare it. For instance, if you were to come to my clinic, you got started on CGM 3 months ago, I could look at the first couple of weeks after you got started and then look at all the improvements that you've made and kind of compare where you're at now. Really simple and easy to use, and it's meaningful. We know that the more we look at Clarity as end users, the better we do.
Also at ATTD, there was a study presented about people with type 2 who are on GLP-1 medication and using CGM. Can you share a little bit about what you learned there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very well versed in GLP-1s as well. I use a lot of them in my clinic, especially with patients, with type 2 diabetes. They are an excellent class of medications. And kind of tying this back to continuous glucose monitoring, I can tell you from my own experience as a clinician that patients that have access to their glucose readings, right, that have CGM, do better no matter what class of medications, but even way better when they're on GLP-1s. These two therapies are meant to be used together. They're not battling. So imagine being a patient that got started on a continuous glucose monitor. You can kind of figure out what foods affect your glucose readings more than others. And then you're started on a GLP-1 therapy, which helps you consume less foods by slowing down gastric emptying. So you're addressing both the quantity and the quality of food by putting these things together. They work in synchrony, and it's amazing the outcomes that we see in the clinic when patients use them together.
And this may be a dumb question, but taking a GLP-1, is there a danger of low blood sugar?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Is there a possibility of hypoglycemia while using GLP-1s? Yes, absolutely, right? It's in the PI for all of them, especially if you're on insulin or if you're on a sulfonylurea. What usually happens is patients start consuming less food. When you're putting less food in, that's less sugar going in. But if we're not careful to adjust medications when starting these or titrating the GLP-1s, hypoglycemia is a very likely outcome. Now, this is why we want them on CGM first, right? Because we don't want these lows, right? As clinicians will all tell you, treating someone with diabetes, hypoglycemia is our biggest fear. If we have a tool that can give our patients some indications that they may be having those, they can take that back to the clinician or maybe even adjust their medications on their own. I've had a handful of patients come into the clinic saying, hey, I had to turn my insulin down because I'm now not eating as much. Congratulations, right? Like they did an excellent job and they didn't even call the office to do that.
And again, this may be a dumb question, but a follow-up on that GLP-1 and CGM study. I assume there was a group that just took the GLP-1 medication and did not wear a CGM. Did they have decent outcome, but it wasn't as dramatic, or was it different?
People who take GLP-1s have reductions in hemoglobin A1C, right? And they're at risk for hypoglycemia, like we said. But when you add the CGM to the GLP-1, you do significantly better, right? These two things work in harmony together to improve outcomes.
See, I think there would be people who would be surprised by that, right? Because they're not, perhaps, and I'll let you explain perhaps the why you shouldn't be surprised. But my point is, there's a contingent of folks who say, well, the medication's doing its job. It doesn't matter. I'm just looking at those numbers, but behaviors are changing.
Absolutely. So you're kind of forced when taking a GLP-1 to adjust your behaviors. Otherwise, you're going to have a whole side effect profile, right? Upset stomach, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting. So you're kind of forced in that sense to eat less. But play that down the road 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, right? In my clinic, I'm trying to get people off of medications and to reinforce the good behaviors that you can instill by using GLP-1s. If you get off of them all of a sudden and your appetite rebounds slightly, if you don't have access to your glucose readings continuously, you're much more likely to go back to those bad behaviors that you ended up needing the GLP-1 for upfront. If at the same time you have a CGM on and you can learn about the quality of foods, what foods I can and should be eating, and you stick to those off of the GLP-1, much better success.
Let's go back to talk about insurance a little bit. I know you're advocating for your patients, but right now, Medicare only covers a CGM if you use insulin or have these hypoglycemic episodes. What's your advice to patients? Like, how do they get access to this stuff until Stelo is on the store shelves without insurance?
Yeah, so that's the tricky part of this, obviously, is that insurance kind of dictates who can and cannot have access to continuous glucose monitoring. Right now, the lowest common denominator is people on insulin, right? So if
Right.
you're on insulin, you have access to Dexcom G7. Now, what about the patients that aren't on insulin and haven't had hypoglycemia or aren't on sulfonylureas? Why shouldn't those patients be looking for better health outcomes as well? That is the market that we're looking to address with this new product. Patients are motivated to try and be healthier, to do better for themselves. We're excited to bring this product to market to serve those needs. In the meantime, what do? Right? We have a little bit of a gap between when Stelo comes out at the end of the summer here. You can ask your provider for a prescription. There is a large percentage of people with commercial insurance, not on insulin, that have good access
Yeah.
to continuous glucose monitors through their insurance. Unless this prescription is written, you wouldn't know. That's a tricky situation, right? So ask for a prescription. You don't know unless you ask is the best way to say that, I guess.
No, that's a great way to say it because it's all, insurance is bananas.
Yeah. And research is continuously coming out, right? If we looked back at the randomized controlled trials done 10 years ago versus the number of them getting done now by multiple companies in this space, we're excited because the more data that keeps coming out, we haven't seen that continuous glucose monitoring is bad for people. It's nothing but good news. And the more good news that comes out, the more likely that the insurances have to really pay attention to that. And that kind of bringing that back to that small project that I recently presented on, right? So that was 250 people. And we're now enrolled over 500 people in this project. As time keeps going by and we keep seeing these amazing outcomes that people that aren't on an intensive insulin therapy have just by getting better access to using CGM. We're hoping that that'll push more doors open.
Before I let you go, what's your big dream here? You've seen it change so much since that rep came in your office and you tried to kick her out. But here you are about to launch a product for, as you said, 25 million people. When you think about it, what's your dream in terms of CGM and helping people with diabetes?
I love this question because no one's asked me this before. What's my dream? So going back to when I was a kid, you would ask me what I wanted to do when I grew up, I would have told you to be a diabetes doctor. But what that dream has morphed over the years, seeing technology keep advancing is, and the reason I took this job with Dexcom is my dream is that everyone that has a disease of balancing your glucose, diabetes, whether it be type 1 or type 2, that we all have equal and unencumbered access to having a continuous glucose monitor. I tell every patient that comes through my clinic, the most important prescription that I can write you is a continuous glucose monitor. It really empowers people to take control of their health. And my dream is that when all is said and done, and I'm 6 feet underground looking up, that everyone is wearing a CGM that has diabetes.
And I said it was before I let you go, but I'm adding another question because you just said something that occurred to me. You're a doctor with type 1 who sees patients with all types of diabetes. I'm curious if your type 2 patients are ever like, do you wear this? Like, let me see. How does it work for you? I mean, you have a really unique perspective. I assume you share that with some of your patients.
Part of the initial education as you're coming in is that I run a clinic, which I call a judgment-free zone. I have this disease. You have this disease. Neither of us wants it. Here's what's going to happen if we don't take care of it. But guess what? That doesn't happen because we're going to take care of it. And here's the tool, a continuous glucose monitor, that's going to allow us to do that.
Do you ever get patients who say, well, you have the bad kind or you have the worst kind, or, I can't feel bad because you have it worse or mine doesn't count?
I get that question once a day. And I'm going to tell you what I tell every one of them. The worst type of diabetes is the one that is not controlled. Type 1 is no worse than type 2. Type 2 is no worse than type 1. If you don't control it, you will succumb to the poor outcomes that we know that are associated with it. But if you take it and you control it, we can put all of that stuff on the back burner.
Dr. Grace, I feel like I could talk to you all day. I hope you come back. It was wonderful getting to know you. I appreciate the information, and we'll be speaking again. Thanks so much.
I'll be excited to come back.
More information about all the things we talked about over at diabetes-connections.com. Just click on the Type 2 show, and there should be some more information for you. Every episode has its own little homepage. I do want to mention a couple of things. And if you're a longtime listener, especially of the other show, Diabetes Connections, which focuses on type 1 and people who use insulin, you will know this. I often talk to people from these companies who are working in one specific department, so they cannot answer questions about another one. I had a lot of questions about cost of Stelo and about when it would be out. But that's not Dr. Grace's department. So I did ask Dexcom, and they said that Stelo is expected to launch late this summer. It should be out this year. It will include a cash pay option and will be offered at a competitive price. They did not share any other details about specific pricing. They said they would have more details closer to launch. I also asked, this is the first over-the-counter CGM. So we have a lot of experience in the type 1 community with these products. My son has been using a continuous glucose monitor since 2013. Wow, more than 10 years now. But we haven't had one that wasn't all tied up with insurance. So I asked about, can you use HSA? Will you be able to use FSA on this? If you're paying cash, will places have it for discounted? There's not a lot of information on that yet. But as we get closer, I'm sure there will be. And once this is out in the world, we'll all be a lot smarter. So I will keep you posted on that. If you have questions, though, please contact me, Stacy at diabetes-connections.com. I try to talk to these folks as much as I can and pass your questions along to them. Even if we're not doing a full episode, if there's any kind of urgency or something I might be able to help with, I'm more than happy to do that. Also, we have a great group, Diabetes Connections, the group. I think it's one of the few places, frankly, on social media where people with type 1 and type 2 mix, talk to each other, and keep it very civil and nice. I run a very tight ship in my Facebook groups. I have another one that's just for locals, for parents of kids with type 1 in the Charlotte, North Carolina area. But Diabetes Connections, the group. If you're not there yet and you want to be, please come on in and ask your type 2 questions. It's a very welcoming and smart community. Thank you, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacy Sims. I'll see you back here soon. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacy Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.